So there's about 3-4 weeks left until your exam, and I've marked a few pieces of work this week, and I'm still a little bit concerned because we don't seem to quite have got this message that there are two key fundamental things you must do in this exam. One of them being that you must compare. It's not good enough to just write about one ruler, then another ruler, then another ruler, then another ruler. The whole point of this module is to show that you can compare between the rulers and show how things changed or where things stayed the same, how things were similar, how things were different. You must use comparing words, contrastingly, similarly, likewise, all that sort of stuff. And then you can pop in some specialist knowledge. But it's really going to scupper your chances if you don't compare. Now, this podcast, as you might be able to tell from the rather long-winded title, is an exercise in which you can test yourself out on what paragraphs you would choose when faced with an exam situation. So the idea is that I have a question that flashes up on the screen in front of you. You've got a chance to pause, and then you should try it as fairly quickly. Put in a bit of thought perhaps into it. Plan your answer. Plan what 3 or 4 paragraphs you're going to choose to decide to do, and ideally maybe put the odd bit of knowledge underneath. Now, this podcast isn't about knowledge, it's about choosing the correct paragraphs to tackle the question. But there will be the odd bit of knowledge in there along the way, though you'll probably want to use the other podcasts for the real specialist knowledge that can make you stand out. So here's your first question. What I recommend you do at this point is pause the video and then try to think about which paragraphs you would use and maybe some of the knowledge that would go in each paragraph. So pause now. So what you're about to hear is not an exhaustive list. It's taken from having read the examiner's report and the mark scheme that went with this question. And in the mark scheme, it says examiners must be prepared to reward alternative arguments or alternative points that are not mentioned in this mark scheme. If they're in doubt, they need to speak to basically their boss. So it's not exhaustive, but these are the ones that the examiners say you should probably have used, or were the most commonly rewarded paragraphs. So they said for a question like this that you could have done paragraphs on ideologies, structures of government, tools of government, local government, repression and censorship. And that's it. But if you did repression and censorship, it's probably not a good idea to do tools of government as well, because the tools of government tend to be, one of the main features of that is the secret police or propaganda and censorship, so that they wouldn't really go together. If you want to know what I would do for this specific question and which paragraphs I would use, actually there's a very detailed podcast on turning point essays, which I would recommend you have a listen. So we're not going to go into detail on that particular one, so those are the 5 possible paragraphs that the examiner's report and mark scheme suggest that you could use. On to the next question. So here's a question that very much focuses in on study section 3, which is about the economy and society, and in particular it's talking about society here and what the Tsars did to improve these lives of the people. You could write about the economy in this paragraph, I suppose, but it have to link very closely to how people lived, and I suppose many of the changes that people made in industry or agriculture, they related directly to the things that I'm about to suggest you could have written your paragraphs about. So, 4 things that I perhaps would suggest from the mark scheme and the examiner's report that you could have chosen to do here. One of them is living conditions, another one is working conditions, another one's civil rights, and you could do one on education. And incidentally, there's podcasts on all of those things on the Knowledge podcast page, so if you want some more specialist knowledge. Of course, you also have to think of your argument, so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in this case. And you really could argue that the communist leaders did less than the Tsars, or you could argue that the Tsars did less than the communists. Perhaps a more complex assessment of this would be that showing that you don't necessarily have to group all the communists in together and the Tsars in together. Perhaps some communists did better than others, and better than some Tsars, and some Tsars did better than some communists at improving the lives of the working class in the period. I suppose things that you would have to watch out for is straying too far into the economy, which would be the temptation, and maybe straying into government sectors, because much of the changes in government actually didn't have so much of an impact on the working class. You could have done propaganda, censorship, repression, that sort of thing, but it doesn't necessarily tie so directly to the question as the 4 things that the examiner's report on Marx scheme suggest you should do about. The thing to remember, which is something that's definitely clear in the Marx scheme, is that a lot of students saw working class and wrote quite a lot about peasants and not very much about the urban working class, otherwise known, of course, as the proletariat. So if he's anything in a question about the working class, well, that takes into account the working class peasants in rural areas of Russia and working class proletariat in the more urban areas of Russia. This sort of question can be quite a difficult one to think of your paragraphs so as to keep the essay thematic with plenty of comparison in it. One of the paragraphs you could have done could have been opposition from individuals and cliques. You could have done a paragraph on opposition from the proletariat, which would include perhaps a big section on Mensheviks and Bolsheviks and strikes through the Tsarist period and through the communist period and even maybe through 1917 with the provisional government. You could do a bit about the wreckers that maybe didn't really exist as a serious problem, more of an excuse under Stalin. Another paragraph could have been about the peasantry and their opposition. So that would incorporate something maybe about the socialist revolutionaries, about peasant uprisings, resistance to collectivization, or the grain requisitioning of war communism. You could even have chosen to do a paragraph on opposition from the nobility. Even under the Tsars, the nobility resisted certain things. I mean, famously, you could talk about the Emancipation Act and how they resisted that. They resisted Witte and his aim to industrialize Russia at the expense of agriculture, which ended up with Witte being replaced as finance minister, though of course he did return as prime minister. The nobility opposed Nicholas in the end. They were upset with how he was ruling the country, and maybe with Rasputin and the Tsarina as well. The nobility also resisted the Bolsheviks, certainly at the start with the Whites and the Civil War, but then opposition from the nobility kind of disappears, because anybody who could have said they were nobility living still in Russia after the Civil War, well, they weren't going to last very long. And I suppose if you're thinking about this question carefully in your argument, it's actually quite difficult to say that opposition to Russian governments was ineffective. I mean, think about it. Opposition overthrew the government. So, well, if we go to... There's all sorts of aspects where opposition actually had an impact, and therefore it might not have been the most effective opposition all the time, but it had some elements of effectiveness. So, for example, 1905, with the opposition there, that caused the opening of the State Duma. Fast forward to February 1917, and the opposition there resulted in the replacement of autocracy. Fast forward a tiny bit to October 1917, and the opposition there of the Bolsheviks manages to overthrow the provisional government and establish a communist dictatorship. So to say that opposition to Russian governments was ineffective is a bit wrong, because opposition had some success and then became part of the government often, which then spawned new opposition to them. So to say that it was all ineffective is perhaps a bit simplistic would be something that I would suggest you could consider in an argument such as this. Well, if you were on the ball here, you'd recognise that this is a question that we've seen before in my big podcast and in the first question. The only thing that's really changed is the focus of the question is now 1905 revolution. And it doesn't specifically mention the turning, like the word turning point. And it's not a how far do you agree question. However, what you have to do is tackle whether this particular turning point changed Russian government more than any other event. So essentially, it's the same question with a different focus, which is 1905 revolution. And therefore, your paragraphs should probably be, or could be, something about ideologies, a paragraph maybe on structures, a paragraph perhaps on tools of government, and perhaps a paragraph on local government, or maybe one on repression and censorship. But of course, don't do this if you do tools of government as a paragraph. And so thinking about your argument in this question, well, I'd personally find it quite hard to argue that this changed Russian government more than other events, because really what the 1905 revolution did was change Russian government a little bit, introducing the State Duma, whereas the events of 1917 in particular, well, they were a colossal change in all sorts of ways, which you can hear more about on my podcast, about a question such as this, on the Turning Point essay example on the website. Well, this essay seems to be a bit of a gift of a question from what it says in the mark scheme and examiners' reports, because there are so many paragraphs that you could have chosen to do. Repression and terror could have been one paragraph, when you're considering whether they ruled in the same way. Structures of government is another thing you could have written about. Ideology itself. Propaganda and censorship could have been another paragraph. Maybe a section specifically on reform, or another paragraph on actions towards the economy. Just an aside, perhaps for this type of essay, because there's so much you could write about, I may have made a paragraph about structures of government and ideology as one particular paragraph, because I could have then selected my juiciest points to make. Another reason I like this question is because, well, it's really clearly and obviously asking you to compare the different rulers here. And you could compare the communists themselves to how much they ruled in the same way, and the Tsars as well. I think it's, again, if you're thinking about your argument, really quite simplistic to say that they ruled Russia in the same way. Every single one of the rulers, from Alexander II through to the provisional government and all the way up through to Khrushchev, well, they all had at least one particular way that, well, more than one particular way, a number of ways in which they ruled differently to each other. And you can explore this in those paragraphs that I've already mentioned. But of course, you wouldn't be able to write 6 paragraphs. You'd have to narrow it down somehow into the paragraphs that you felt most comfortable with. But there'd be loads to say in this essay. It would be an absolute gift of a question if you got something along these lines. Now, as opposed to the gift of a question that you got the last time, this one's tricky. I mean, me and Mr. Lewis were talking about this the other day, and we were thinking, what would we have done in this situation? And I think the examiners, judging by what I've read in the report on the mark scheme, I think they realised that this was a very narrow question to ask when they came to marking it, judging by some of the things that they said in the mark scheme and examiner's report, of course. The problem is, we both thought, well, we'd have written a paragraph obviously about industry and the economy there, and then we'd have written a paragraph about agriculture and the economy there. And then what? Where do you go from there? And that might have been what happened to you when you tried to plan this, having paused the video. Well, a third possible paragraph you could have written about could have been infrastructure, i.e. railways, workers' housing, how education supported the economy. It's a real loose fitting one. It's not directly related to economy, but it is definitely related to economy, and it's something you could have chosen to write about. But the reason why I think the examiners kind of probably thought, well, maybe we shouldn't have asked this question, was because they said in the examiner's report that, and I'll quote, a relative comparison of economic development under the Tsars from 1855 to 1917, and then under communism may be undertaken. So in other words, you could have written a paragraph about the industry of the Tsars, and then the industry of the communists, and then the industry of, the agriculture of Tsars, and then another paragraph, the agriculture of communists. But it then says, so long as comparisons across the period are still made within those paragraphs. And so you can see it's kind of a muddle as to what you could have done. And in a question like this is where you've really got to think. If you're stumped, think, right, whatever I do here, I just need to make sure that I focus on what the question is asking here. And the way that you could have made yourself stand out, maybe in the introduction and the conclusion, is to establish this idea of the word success in the economy. How do you measure success in economic terms? Because the different rulers maybe had different ideas of what success was in some cases. Now, we've just had a really hard question where it's difficult to choose your paragraphs. I think for this one it should be fairly straightforward. The thing that's going to separate candidates in this answer, as is very often the case, is one word in the question that's often overlooked. And in this case, that word is transformed. Because some students just wrote about whether it changed. Transformed is a very strong word. And if you take anything from this podcast, you must realise that the examiner will always, or will often, put one word in there which students might overlook or replace with another word. I know, for example, recently in my class we've done a question on modernisation, and they've just sort of skirted over that word as though it's accepted of what it is. You could explain what modernisation is in that particular question. Or somebody replaced the word modernisation with the word improved in their essay. And improved and modernisation are not necessarily the same thing. So in this one, it's the word transformed you'd have to take some sort of issue with, because it means just like a wholesale, complete change. And there's a lot that you could write about, because the last one was quite a difficult one to choose your paragraphs. Examiner's report and mark scheme suggest there's lots of things you could have written about here. And here are some possible paragraphs. So you could have done a paragraph on living conditions. You could have done a paragraph on working conditions. You could have done a paragraph on repression and terror. You could have done a paragraph on military demands, like how the peasantry were forced into the army at times. Or maybe a bit about the Civil War and how they joined the Greens. You could have done a paragraph on state-driven reform. So like how they enforced collectivization, or how they emancipated but meant the redemption payments, and so on and so forth, which kind of relates to another paragraph you could have done, which could have been fiscal pressures, so monetary pressures, economic pressures on the peasantry. That probably would have been a hard one to do. And you could have done about education. Of course, some of these don't fit together. So, for example, if you did repression and terror, you might talk about the kulaks and collectivization and the forcing of that and famine. And if you write about another paragraph called state-driven reform, or the subtopic of that name, well, there's going to be too much similar there, because state-driven reform often led to repression and terror. Also, if you're thinking on your feet and you've got a lot of juicy things to write, and there's things you want to put in here and you're not sure which paragraphs to go for, I might have done a paragraph in which living conditions and working conditions came in the same subtopic, came in the same paragraph. So there's lots of things you could have written about for this answer, and there's a wide range of conclusions you could come to here. You could suggest that perhaps the peasantry in Russia's life was not changed very much at all in that whole period. You could suggest that it was changed, but not transformed. Or you could suggest that it was only transformed right at the end, perhaps. There's many, many, many other possible arguments you could have for this. It's a great question, so long as you've done your revision enough to be able to have the specialist knowledge. So for this question, it wouldn't be unusual, so far as the examiners suggest, if you'd got a bit stumped on this word autocrat. You needed to have revised carefully the section on government, the study section 1. Candidates needed to show, so the examiners, what an autocrat was, but some students got stumped by the phrase effective autocrats, and they just wrote an essay as though it said effective rulers. But of course, an autocrat is something that's not the same as a ruler. There's certain features of autocracy that you should be aware of, such as their paternalistic duty, the fact that they believe they were put on the throne by God, that they should be the ones with the only, with the ultimate say, and so on and so forth. And there's features of autocracy, which is largely, well, certainly the period that was under the Tsars, which some people suggest were also features of the communist period of rule. So things you could have assessed were repression and terror, ideologies, the use of reform, or structures of government. And it's a question that would really separate the weak from the strong, because you would have to have quite a strong understanding of what this word autocrat was. You'd have had to have picked out effective autocrat and sort of tackled this word effective, but also the word autocrat as well. And there's not too many paragraphs that you could write about according to the examiner's report and mark scheme. A lot of the things that you would write about in this are to do with that study section 1, but not all of them, because autocrats, well, the way that they rule and the things that they do, they go across all of the study sections, which is perhaps why the use of reform generally is something that you could have tried to tackle. Quite a tough question, quite a tricky one, but one that if you could do, well, it might make you stand out a little bit, because other people would struggle with this one. Well, bizarrely, you may have recognised I've spoken about this question earlier on in the podcast, because my class have recently attempted this question and they got a little bit stuck on some areas. First of all, lots of them wrote about the different rulers, one after the other, after the other, after the other, without comparing how the rulers were trying to modernise Russia. Or a lot of them just skated over this whole word modernise, and what does it actually mean to modernise something. And if you look at it in detail, you'll see that although there's many similarities, some of the different rulers had different ideas about what modernising really was. And one of the candidates, or one of the students in my class, seemed in their mind to exchange the word modernise for improve. And they're not necessarily the same things. So again, just as a reminder, make sure you're always comparing in this exam. Also make sure you're focusing on the key words and you're using those key words. If there's something there that you can grab hold of and question and focus on, that you use them to make yourself stand out a bit. Anyway, this is quite a good question because there's so many things you could write about. You could really break this down. But actually, I would break this down into 3 paragraphs where there's, again, it kind of covers all bases. Because you could have talked about how Russian rulers maybe tried to modernise politics, or in a political sense, or government itself. You could have written a paragraph about how Russian rulers tried to modernise Russian economy. You could talk about how Russian rulers tried to modernise Russian military. Or you could talk about how Russian rulers tried to modernise Russia socially. It is a great question. It's one of those juicy ones where if I saw it and started to plan it, I might start to think, hold on, there's so much that I could write about here. And it's a gift, really, if you've done lots of revision, because if you've got something great to say, you could probably fit it in an essay like this. It's not one of the more narrow ones. I'd recommend going back and using this podcast again and seeing if you can choose paragraph themes that the examiner's report suggests you should use once you've listened to it through once. See if you can remember. What you do need to keep in your mind is that the chances of the examiner's asking you a question that looks almost the same as one of the questions on this podcast are, well, you'd have to be quite lucky, shall we say. There's a chance that you may be lucky enough to be able to answer a question which you recognise as very similar to something that you've seen here or you've listened to in one of the other podcasts. But more realistically, you're going to have to think on your feet. And so long as you keep in your head, I've got to compare, I've got to have specialist knowledge, and I've got to use those key words in the question and to my advantage in terms of questioning them, showing you understanding of them, and really honing in on them in your essay, then you will be fine. But yeah, train yourself as much as you can using this podcast, and good luck with your revision.